Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning. Good morning. Got a lot to discuss today, and I'm excited. Good morning. So glad to see some faces down here. Welcome, Lady Barbara. Welcome, Prophet Jonathan. Welcome, Pastor Ben. Thank you all so much for those of you who are tuning in every single day. I like to call you my We Dare Squad. Good morning, Lady Vanessa. And also I do have the broadcast going on YouTube live stream as well. Periscope, for whatever reason, is not archiving my videos, so I do need a place to archive. So that's why I'm also doing it on YouTube live stream. Generally, I take my Periscope files and I upload them, but I can't do that. So I am now live streaming on YouTube as well. So good morning, good morning, good morning. A very good question was posed this morning, and I want to take some time to answer it before we go into our reading. So I'm just letting you know we may go over just a little bit today, probably till about 12:10, because I do want to get through a good deal of reading today. All right, so we are going to start out in Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, and I believe, yes, we are on chapter 3, which is a very powerful chapter called New Enemies Disguised as Friends. New Enemies Disguised as Friends. And also, we're going to be back in Dick Gregory's book. I believe we stopped at Nat Turner's Revolt, and so we're going to continue from there. But I am almost pretty much done reading Dick Gregory's book myself. All right, but I want to answer a very, very good question, because I think we need to know, and we need to have this conversation. And so the question was, and you know I'm going to use some visuals. All right, the question was, here's my little visual. What happened to the black church? Now stay with me, because the first thing we got to ask ourselves is, why is there a black church? I don't think people get it. They still don't get it. They still don't understand why there's still a black church. So we're gonna back up, and we're gonna answer the question first. Why is there such thing called the black church? And then we're gonna answer the question, what happened to the black church? Okay. All right. So why is there a black church? Because in the past, all right, in the past, okay, black people and white people were separate on everything, all right? And I know most people want to believe, all right, that black people got their faith from the white people, which is, some of that is partly true, but some of it is not, okay? Some people who were brought over from Africa came with their own faith beliefs, and all of their faith beliefs were not tribal, as many people like to put out there, okay? Some of them were Muslims when they came over. But if you go back further than that, you will find that those who were Muslims were Muslim converts by force, which means they were worshiping and practicing something before that. Yes, I know. It's never taught. All right. So some of these people already had a faith in Yah. That's why they would sing songs like Kum Ba Yah. Okay. So let's be clear. Everybody did not get their faith beliefs from white people. I know that is taught, but it's wrong. Do some research. Okay? I don't have time to teach it all today. But, so, make a long story short, black people and white people were not worshiping together. As you will see, even with Nat Turner, okay, and how he was given a Bible. We talked about that last session, how he was given a Bible. Okay. And as the slaves began to read the scriptures for themselves, they began to realize that some of the things that were being taught, okay, were being taught erroneously to keep them enslaved. All right. And there was a period of time where black people broke off and said, we want our own. We want our own space. We want our own place to worship. Okay. But that came much, much later. All right. Late 1800s, early 1900s, I believe. All right. I'm trying to give a quick history. So a part of it was, when you say why do we have a black church? A part of it was we weren't worshiping together in the first place. All right. Second part of it was something called, do I have it? Yeah, I do. Okay. Something called redlining. All right. Put some hearts on the screen if you've heard of redlining. Redlining was a process used to separate black people from white people geographically. Redlining is still going on. It's illegal now, but it's still going on. Okay. So what they would do is they would say, okay, where do we want black people living in our city or in our town? And those would be the places, all right? Those would be the places marked off where black people could either live or they could buy housing, etc., etc. Okay? So when black people would go to move about the country or whatever and move into certain places, even when they moved north from the Great Migration, there were still places that were sectioned off that black people were allowed to move into. Okay. And outside of that, they could not live. So this is history. This is not made up stuff. This actually happened and is happening. Okay. So what happens? If you're only allowed, okay, if you're only allowed to live in certain parts of town, then where are you going to build your church? In those same parts of town, right? So you got Lil Tom's AME church here. You got White House on the Prairie, Abyssinian Methodist Episcopal whatever over here, and then you got another little church over here, and you got another little church over here, right? Okay. So when people say, I don't understand why we have a black church and a white church, you need to understand the history of what got us to this place. Okay. And if you look at the United States now, geographically, we are still very much segregated in our living spaces. We're still very much segregated in where our children go to schools. So unless you're putting your child in a charter school or you're putting your child in a private school, they're not really moving out of their area, the areas where they live in, if that makes any sense. Okay. So we first have to understand this piece of why we have a black church in the first place. All right. Hope everybody got that. If you want to screenshot it, you can screenshot it. Why do we have a black church? Because we started out that way. We started out needing our own space from a manipulated gospel, because the gospel was manipulated to keep us enslaved. And then governmental wise, because of the way we were separated and segregated geographically, this is still a problem. All right. And so when people talk about being intentional about creating a multicultural ministry, right, or creating a multicultural worship space, what they're really talking about is, if you live outside of the red line, you're really the ones who have to actually work on intentionality in cultivating. Because we didn't do this. We didn't do this. The government did. So everybody has to work on intentionality if they're talking about making a space for everybody to enjoy worship with people groups of all tribes, nations, as the scripture says. Everybody has to work on intentionality because this was intentionally done by our government. All right. So now, what happened to the black church? I'm going to tell you some other things about what happened to the black church, right? So the black church, we know, was pretty much instrumental, I would say, in civil rights movement, right? Civil rights movement. Everybody knows about that. Everybody knows that there was a large amount of ministers involved. When you talk about from the Ashkenazi Jewish side, there were rabbis involved in the movement, but primarily the movement was moved along by black ministers and black political leaders at the time. So when people say, what happened to the black church? Well, I'll tell you one thing. Everybody, well, some of you might not know. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, okay? They were a part of the ones who helped to organize in different cities. They were the ones who got ministers and political leaders together and community leaders together to help form and to help plan some of these marches, some of these protests. There were other groups, but the SCLC was one of the major ones that Dr. King was a part of. All right. Well, recently, a couple of years ago, maybe we weren't paying attention, but I remember it. A couple of years ago, the SCLC disbanded because they were saying, the members of it were saying that they didn't really see a need for it anymore. Now, here we are in 2017 and everybody's asking, what happened to the black church? What happened to our organization? What happened to our being able to come together and plan? Well, one of the major organizations that was responsible for doing that kind of thing actually disbanded. Oops. So what does that mean? That means that other people have to step up and create organizations, right, with a faith foundation to them. And we have to come together with leaders, keywords, who have the best interests of the black community at heart. And sometimes that's people that look like you. And sometimes that's people that don't look like you. But the goal is you want to have people that are standing up and speaking on your behalf and representing your community and the interests of your community and not the interests of their pockets. And they're willing to speak on behalf of the interests of the black community. All right. So what has happened since then? What has happened since then? You've had pastors and leaders, for the most part, do either one of two things. Oh, boy. You've had pastors and leaders do one of two things. You've had leaders decide that we've got to build people, educate people, and equip people, all right? We've got to get people educated about their rights, educated about their voter rights. So you still have some churches that do that. You have churches that say we've got to get people economically prepared, right? So these would be the churches that are teaching you about financial literacy. They're teaching you about getting rid of debt. They're teaching you about credit repair. So there are churches that actually do this, okay? There are churches also that have home buyers programs that are helping you to attain and acquire property. All right? Everybody with me? So these are some things that black churches are doing now. You know why? Because they recognize, as Dr. Claude Anderson said, that if you don't have an economic floor and you don't have a political floor, or you don't have political candidates that represent your community and the interests of your community, not only faith-based interests, but also interests for your particular people group, to move people from poverty okay, and below poverty to actually a standard of living, if you don't have that, then you're going to get crushed by the systems that are in operation. Because what do they operate off? They operate off economics and they operate off political power. So if you don't have those two, they don't really want to hear what you have to say, even if you are a believer, okay? So you have black churches that are doing this. They're mobilizing the people, they're teaching their people, and they're educating them. They're equipping them for this life and the next life. Bravo, hats off to those black leaders in churches that are doing this on a consistent basis, whose names is not in the paper. Most of the time, they're not on TBN. They're not on the Word Network. They're not on those platforms, okay? But it is happening. I know a lot of them, so I know it is happening. They're doing economic community development, where they're starting organizations and they are doing community planning, where they're building homes, they're building nursing facilities, they're building schools. All of that has to do with the economics of a community. And there are plenty of churches out there that are doing that. And then on the other side, you have some leaders who are saying, let me see if I can draw this correctly. They're doing this. It's all about the Benjamins. They are. So you got two different models going here. And I'm going to tell you, all right, the model that gets the most attention is this side over here. And so if you are not careful, you will let media shape and frame your mind as to what the black church is really about. If you are not careful, your imagery of the black church will be only this over here, because that's what media puts out. And one thing that I do know is that we become what we consistently behold. So if this is all you see, okay? If this is all you see by television programming, Greenleaf, Empire, okay? If this is all you see by television programming, with our movies, with TV shows. See, I don't watch a lot of TV, so I don't let media shape my perception of what the church is called to be. But unfortunately, a lot of people do. All right? And that's not just with the church. That's with black people and black community. A lot of us spend too much time letting the media shape our opinion of our own community. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Because if I start talking about it too long, I'm just going to get angry. All right. Off, OFF, off is the best button right now for Black America. That's my personal opinion. Off is the best button. Why would I keep watching programming that is not meant for me? Why would I keep watching imagery that only presents my people group in a negative light? Why? There's nothing I want to see on television right now. Not a thing. I watch some documentaries, but in terms of something that's supposed to represent me as a black person, something that's supposed to represent me as a woman, something that's supposed to represent me as a black woman, I don't see it on television, so why would I watch it? That's just my personal opinion. You don't have to agree with me. But the programming is toxic. It is. To me, it is toxic. Because now, and how do I know it's toxic? Because now we have people that used to respect the body of Christ operating in total disrespect. And I know it's because this is the only image they see. And when you have been seeing this as an image for people who look like you and people who are of the faith and of the cloth, and you've been getting this fed to you for at least a decade now, all right? They've just amped it up. But at least a decade, you've been getting this image of the black church as only about money. So now what happens? It's not surprising to me that people have a disrespect and a scorn for black people in the black church. Just think about it. Look at your television shows that are centered around anything to do with faith and tell me the good that you see inside of the show. You can't tell me. All right. So again, the leaders who are doing the empowerment, who are doing the educating, who are doing the building, who are doing the community development, who are hitting the streets, who are advocating for the rights of black people, who are in the community meetings, who are going to the police programs to create conversation between police officers and the community, who are going and doing mentorship in the prisons and the juvenile detention centers. Those leaders are not being recognized. Those leaders are not even being put on a platform for the most part. So you're only getting a one-sided view of the black church. All right. So I just wanted to say that and make those points clear, that let's pay attention to the narrative that we ourselves are starting to take on that are media driven. Lastly, I want to say this. I got a chance couple days ago to watch the PBS special of the Black Panthers. And what made this documentary so interesting is that it was the Black Panthers' own footage. So it was never before seen footage that was presented by the Panthers themselves. Okay. And one of the things in one of the documents that was shown, okay, some of you have heard of this and some of you haven't. All right. In the official documents concerning the FBI and their investigation of the Black Panthers, there is a program called Cointelpro, which stands for Counterintelligence Program, but they shorten it to Cointelpro. If you go look up and start reading up on Cointelpro, you will begin to understand why there is so much ratchetness going on right now in the black community and why it seems like the black community cannot get itself together. It's intentional. Let me give you one of the statements from Cointelpro. All right. For Cointelpro, they said that the goal was to discredit, neutralize, and eliminate let me make sure I write this out for you so you can see it. Discredit, neutralize, and eliminate any black person that could be seen as a messiah for the people. He that hath an ear, let him hear. Okay? So if that is the whole goal of your program, is to discredit, neutralize, eliminate any black person who could be seen as a messiah and unify black people, that will help you understand why Malcolm X, MLK, Marcus Garvey, Medgar Evers, okay, that's just a few of them, right? But these all start with M, so you can remember. Malcolm, Martin, Marcus, and Medgar were all murdered. By your government. Okay? Are we clear? I just want to know. Can somebody put a yes or a no on the screen? Are we clear as to why there is a problem with black unity? Are we clear? Are we clear? Because if I hear one more person talk about what's wrong with the black community and why we can't get out there together, I'm probably going to blow a gasket. But I don't want to blow a gasket. I just want to teach. All right? So if you have any questions, please go and look this up and do the research. All right? In other words, if you have the possibility to unite the black community, guess who's coming for you? It's really that simple. If you have the goal and the desire to unify black people in this country and connect them worldwide to people of color, that's called Pan-Africanism, by the way, guess who's coming for you? Guess. Just guess. And I know people think that this program has been disbanded, but clearly it hasn't. How do we know? How do we know? I'm going to tell you how. How do we know this program has not been disbanded? That's how we know. That is how we know. Do I agree with everything that he may have done in his life? Absolutely not. Do I agree with his past background or his history or his girlfriend or who he's connected to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? All the stuff they're trying to bring up? Absolutely not. But here's what I do know. The goal of COINTEL is to discredit, neutralize, and eliminate anybody who can be perceived as a black messiah and as unifying the people. And this dude right here, who's doing it in a peaceful manner, is a problem. So when people say, well, why is the president all of a sudden talking about this particular guy? Why is he talking about this particular guy? That's why. That's why, right there. That's exactly why. So, I want to say this. Those of you who are called to unify black Americans and help some of them to wake up and help some of them to come to their senses. And yeah, y'all better be praying for Colin. You may not like him. You may not even understand his methods, but the government does. The government does. And so my question is, are we going to... All right, glad that this is helping you. Are we going to sit back and watch them do to him what they did to everybody else? Have we learned the lesson yet? Or are we still in la la land? I just want to know. Have we learned yet? Or are we still in la la land? I don't see what the big deal is. You wouldn't see what the big deal is if you don't understand this program. So that's why I'm not going to give you all the information. I'm going to tell you what it is, and I'm going to suggest that you go study. Okay? And the names that I gave you, okay? These are just a few of the people that were eliminated. All right? So, why are activists or why are black people getting booted off of social media like Facebook? Why won't they allow some of our videos to stay up? Why did they ban Dr. Boyce Watkins permanently from Facebook? Some of y'all didn't know that, did you? He has administrators operating his pages now because he has been permanently banned from Facebook. YouTube now, if your video has the word race or racism in the title of your YouTube video, it automatically defunds that video, meaning that if you have your video set up where you can get monies from them because you allow ads to run through your videos, if your video has race or racism in the title, YouTube automatically defunds your video. I just want y'all to wake up and know what time it is. All right, moving right along. So I hope I've given you something to think about. There's plenty of books out there on the Black church and how we got to where we are. Oh, and by the way, some of the early Black churches, actually had Ethiopian Christians to help them found their church. So their churches were actually based on Coptic Christianity as opposed to European Christianity. But that's a whole other study, because most of us think that the Black church just took on the white man's religion. But just do some research, all right? Other books I want to encourage you to get if you are wanting to learn more about slavery, about capitalism. We may get to some of these this season. If not, Lord willing, we'll get to it in season 3. But I want to show them to you. So those of you who are screenshotted, you can screenshot. This one is called The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. So what this book talks about in minute detail, this one talks about in a greater detail, okay? Here's another one. Lies My Teacher Told Me by James W. Lowen, author of Lies Across America. James Lowen also wrote the book here that I'm getting ready to show you. He also wrote, and this actually talks a little bit about redlining, but also another phenomenon that most Black people are familiar with. You just may not have heard the term, but he also wrote Sundown Towns. Okay, I didn't hear this term until I came to the slave state of Virginia. But this idea is very well known, especially if you live in Florida, you live in Georgia. African Americans would tell you certain towns not to drive through, or certain towns not to be found in after dark. That's what this is talking about. Sundown towns, a hidden dimension of American racism. See, the sign says whites only within city limits after dark. These are the places where lynchings still go on. These are the places where you might wind up as a Black person that's disappeared and dumped into a river. All right. So that's what this whole book is about. The actual towns where this happened. Okay. And then the last one, I'm excited about this book because the gentleman is a Florida A&M University graduate and a University of Florida graduate. And he is now up here in the DC area. And he's actually getting ready to start an anti-racist policy center at the American University up here. So I'm going to try to get in touch with him and see if I can get an interview with him. And his name is Ibram X. Kendi. And he has written the National Book Award winning work, Stamped from the Beginning: The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And I think he said it took him about 6 years to do the research for this book. All right. So turn off the TV and read. That's my suggestion. All right. I love y'all. All right. So let's start some reading today. Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. We are on chapter 3. And I can't believe someone is trying to call me right now. Chapter 3. New enemies disguised as friends. Great phrase. Very, very great phrase. New enemies disguised as friends. The Ghanaian writer A. Adu Boahin in the article The Coming of the Europeans, circa 1440 to 1700, gives us the following information about this significant event in history. Africa south of the Sahara has been known to Europeans since Greco-Roman times, but it was not until the 4th decade of the 15th century that they began to arrive in numbers on its shores. The first to come were the Portuguese. They were followed in the 1450s by the Spaniards, who soon after abandoned Africa to explore the Americas. Toward the end of the century, some English and French adventurers and traders arrived. However, their governments were not to give official backing to such enterprises until the 16th and 17th centuries. The Dutch were the next to appear on the African scene, and during the last decade of the 16th century, they effectively challenged the lead enjoyed by the Portuguese. All right. The Danes dropped anchor in 1642, the Swedes in 1647, and the Brandenburgers in 1682. The reasons for this sudden surge of interest were partly political, partly economic, partly technological. In the first place, no overseas activities could succeed without the patronage and direction of a strong nation state enjoying stable and peaceful conditions at home, and no such nation states emerged in Europe until after the end of the 14th century, and these continued to be racked by foreign and civil wars for another 100 years or more. The nation states of Europe stabilized themselves and developed their economy mainly at the expense of African people. Professor Bowenhin further tells us that, on balance then, politically, economically, and socially, the European presence and activities in Africa during the second period were virtually an unmitigated disaster for the Africans. By 1700, all the great hopes that had been conjured up during the earlier phase of exploration had turned sour. To borrow Basil Davidson's terms, Africa had by then turned into the Black Mother, producing slaves solely in the interest of the growing capitalist system in Europe and the New World. And it was to do this for another 150 years. At the beginning of their contact, sub-Saharan Africa was politically, culturally, and artistically comparable to Europe. By 1700, Europe had leaped forward technologically and socially, but Africa and its black peoples had become paralyzed and impoverished, a tragedy from which they still have not recovered. Even our interesting President number 45 recently remarked that, yes, all of my friends come to Africa to basically utilize you all's wealth and use you. Like he said that in a national or international speech. Who does that? But he was actually right on that part. In his pamphlet, The Man Who Stole a Continent, John Weatherwax spoke collectively of the British entry into the slave trade. While he used a single figure in relationship to this entry, he was actually referring to the collective assault of Europeans on the west coast of Africa and how the slave trade became a three-continent industry. There was a man who stole a continent, being cruel as well as greedy and possessing power. He enslaved 20 million of his people, sending them over the ocean, 10 million to the eastern hemisphere and 10 million to the western hemisphere. In the process of capturing the 20 million people whom he sold, 80 million other people died, some during slave raids, for when a village was raided, often the very young and very old and the sick were killed. Some from exposure, some from disease and grief during shipment abroad, and some by suicide at the water's edge or in transit. The sale of 20 million human beings as slaves gave the man hundreds of millions of treasure, but this was only the start of his enrichment. He and his children and great-grandchildren and those to whom they sold slaves received much, much more, many billions more through the unpaid labor of whole generations of slaves. But this too was not at all the end of their enrichment. Professor Weatherax concludes his analysis of the start of the slave trade in the following manner. For the morality of the man who stole a continent and of his children and grandchildren and agents can only be characterized as most way out evil this world has ever known. And way out evil is satanic and has only one possible end: to be cast out altogether and forever from society known as humankind, to be cast into the burning fire which is its natural home, to be remembered only by the generations which follow its end, as the most devastating catastrophe that ever befell humankind. The events described by John Weatherax were the beginning of the African Holocaust and a period of protracted genocide that would change the political character of the world for all times to come. I've read for you chapter 3, New Enemies Disguised as Friends. We're moving into the book with Dick Gregory, but please, let's be clear. Though genocide is continuing, and we know it is, we don't have to help. Can I say that again? If you already know that there are systems in place causing your genocide, you don't have to help. You don't have to help it along. Well, how are we helping it along, Shantae? I'm glad you asked. You don't have to kill your own children. You don't have to beat your own children to death. You don't have to shoot each other and kill each other in the streets. That's how you help genocide along. Selah. All right. Moving into Defining Moments in History, Black History, Reading Between the Lies by Dick Gregory. Frederick Douglass. This is Dick Gregory's take on Frederick Douglass. I want you to check out something that Frederick Douglass wrote in his book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. This is what he said. I don't know why my stand is doing what it's doing over here. Let's see. All right. He said this: slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves. And this too in some cases, when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves to even fall out and quarrel amongst themselves, defending the goodness of their slave masters. Oh boy. Each contending for the superior goodness of his own master over that of the others. It was so popular on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contended that he was the richest master, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight between the slaves. And those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their slave masters was transferable to themselves. Y'all, it was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. Wow. What my man Frederick Douglass is saying here is some heavy stuff. It just goes to show you that as much as slavery messed up people's bodies, it also messed up their minds even more. It was bad enough that black people had to work for nothing for Colonel Lloyd and Jacob Jepson, but hundreds of thousands of other evil men just like them. It was bad enough that they got whipped and sold away from their parents and children and husbands and wives. It was bad enough that their lives were not their own. But what's worse than that is that the slaves who identified with their masters as if the slaves' value depended on what their masters were like. What they were like was evil. They were called masters because they owned human beings. And the slaves were ready to fight each other over which of the low-down, filthy slave owners owned us was the best. That's what you call some psychological mess happening in the minds of slaves. But it wasn't the slaves' fault. Like Douglas wrote, slaves are like other people. When you think about it, it's a wonder more black folks didn't fight with one another instead of fighting against the white man the way Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, David Walker, and a whole lot of others did. While you're busy shaking your head over these dumb slaves, ask yourself this: are we any better today? Ooh, Jesus. If Dick Gregory were here today, he'd probably be looking at the NFL and these owners, and he'd be like, what kind of foolishness is this? I can only imagine him in my head saying that. Black people put on the uniform of the U.S. military, our masters, and we go to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and anywhere else Uncle Sam tells us to go. And we fight and kill yellow-skinned folks and brown-skinned folks on behalf of the United States, our masters, just like slaves fighting other slaves. Meanwhile, back home, 1 out of every half dozen blacks is locked up for committing the same drug crimes as white people who walk around free. What's wrong with that picture? Then you've got blacks in police uniforms out there arresting other blacks. Blacks in America really need to study the Jews in Germany. Those Jews never thought that they were part of Hitler's system in any way, shape, or form. They never sided with the people oppressing them, but we do. We go to war. What kind of abomination is that? How many blacks go to war because we can't find a job and are willing to kill or be killed just so we can feed ourselves and our families? Getting back to Frederick Douglass, it's like he said, slaves are like other people. Too many of us have that slave mentality. It can take a lot to get past that, but a lot of us have, and Frederick Douglass was one. He was born into slavery in 1818 in Maryland. He wasn't with his mother long enough to remember her very well, and the only thing he knew about his father was that he may have been the man who owned him. Douglass shows what you can accomplish when your mind is free. He was somewhat free. A black woman purchased Frederick Douglass freedom, and he wound up marrying that black woman, Anna. But he spent most of his time running around with German women, ignoring his uneducated wife. He was taught to read when he was 8 years old by one of his owners, a white lady. What he didn't learn from her, he picked up himself, sometimes by tricking white boys into showing him how to read and write words. When he got a little bit older, his rebelliousness came to the surface. Most teenagers start to rebel, but Douglass was one teenager with something to rebel against. He got a hold of some anti-slavery writings that fed his anger even more. Soon this got to be too much for his owner, who sent him to another plantation so they could break him. That only made Douglass more determined. A slave driver, Mr. Covey, beat him one day till he was covered in blood. But the next time he tried to lay hands on him, he had a fight on his hands. It lasted a good couple hours. This time, Covey was the one doing the bleeding. He never came near Douglass again. As Douglass wrote in his narrative, this battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. Career as a slave, that cracks me up. He had a sense of humor. Books say he escaped from slavery in 1838 when he was 20, using seaman's papers he had borrowed, then gave lectures for money for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Later, he started his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star, in 1847. In 1852, on the day after Independence Day, Douglass gave a speech for the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York. And if you are on the internet or have been on the internet for any number of years now, you have probably seen this entire speech that was called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." Douglass talked about Americans' most special holiday, and he told it exactly like it was. He started off nice and meek, that he almost seemed to be apologizing for being there. But when he got all those white folks relaxed and comfortable, this is what he had to say. Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? Am I not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary? Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems where we're in human mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. That was Frederick Douglass. All white folks had to do was teach him to use their language, and he was able to use it a lot better than most of them ever would. After the Civil War started, he helped recruit black soldiers for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment to fight against the South and slavery. Years later, after the war was over, the president appointed him minister to Haiti. Fred was one black man who believed in himself and his own potential. Not bad for a dude who started off as somebody else's property, right? All right. Harriet Tubman. The U.S. Treasury Department, has been talking about putting a sister on the $20 bill. Harriet Tubman. You know, if anything like that happens, black folks had nothing to do with it. Because if we did, her picture would be lighter and her hair would be permed. Dick Gregory. Because that's how we think. But when you stop and think about Harriet Tubman and the reason we know about her, white historians picked the woman they wanted. You think out of millions of blacks who were slaves, there was only one woman out there helping slaves escape. They picked the one they wanted, and then they told us, now you leave us alone, okay? See if you can find another one. You ain't got half enough money to do the research, and if you don't do the research, you can't find out. When we stop and think about where we are, we realize we have to challenge everything folks say, even when it sounds good, like putting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Now, that's not to take away anything from Harriet Tubman. She was a hero, sure enough. She was a little slip of a woman, wasn't as big as a minute, couldn't read or write. All her life she had dizzy spells because she once got hit in the head with a piece of metal a slave owner had chucked at another slave. That doesn't sound much like somebody who could lead runaway slaves to Canada, does it? But she did. And if you were one of the slaves she was taking and you got scared and wanted to turn back, she would pull out a pistol and threaten to shoot you. She may have been a little woman, but she was a serious little woman. She was born with the name Araminta Harriet Ross in 1822. She had 8 brothers and sisters. Like Frederick Douglass, she was a rebel. One time she stole some sugar and thought her owner was going to beat her for it, so she hid for 5 days. She had no love for slavery, and getting hit on the head with a piece of metal didn't help. Things like that, plus seeing family members sold away, made her decide that she needed to escape. By then, she had a husband, John Tubman, but when he wouldn't run away with her, she couldn't get anybody else in her family to go with her. She took off by herself. She made it to New Jersey on foot and became a paid domestic worker. Then she decided she wanted to sneak back down south and free her family too. She started with her parents, who were old at that point. Before she was done, she had freed a whole bunch of slaves. Nobody knows the true number. Some say around 150 and some say 300. They called her Black Moses because she freed people like Moses in the Bible freed the Hebrews from Egypt. Except in the case of Moses, we have to take the Bible's word for it. There are pictures of Harriet Tubman, though. She was a spy, too. During the Civil War, when the white officers needed to know what was going on down south, they'd send the free blacks like Harriet because they could pass as slaves. Nobody think twice about seeing one more black person, especially one who was as little and harmless as Harriet Tubman. We shouldn't be underestimated. Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. Now, they tell you that a white man named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793 and put a patent on it the next year. The cotton gin is a machine that separates cotton from cotton seeds. Up until then, black people, slaves, had to do that by hand. The slaves worked themselves to death picking the stuff, but slave owners didn't care because they didn't care about anything when it came to slaves as long as they were working. But they say a white man invented the cotton gin so the job would be easier. If you never liked me, why would you invent a cotton gin to ease my burden? The only people who care how hard it is to pick cotton are the people doing it. That's why when Eli Whitney went to Virginia to visit his mother and father's friend, he saw these slaves sitting out there with this device we now call the cotton gin. And he went back and put a patent on it. Dick Gregory, y'all. The Dred Scott decision. It's funny how much a thing can change and still be called the same thing. Let's say a boy is born. His mama and daddy named him John. When John is a little baby boy, he's just as cute as anything you ever saw, laughing and giggling, and he's even cuter when he gets a couple of years older trying to walk and talk. You just want to eat him up. Now go forward 90, 95 years. His name is still John, but the resemblance ends there. John is as mean as a wet hen, ugly as homemade sin, his skin sagging, so evil his own mama wouldn't claim him, even if she weren't cold in the ground already. John doesn't have one thing in this world in common with that cute little boy from so long ago, but his name is still John. You know what else is like that? The Republican Party. For the record, okay? For the record, I'm a registered Republican for 20 years. So whatever Dick Gregory has to say is Dick Gregory. All right? I got a lot to say too, but don't get me started. Republicans today are the most self-serving on the planet. He actually adds some other words in there, but I'm not going to read them, okay? But they still like to call themselves the party of Lincoln. They should have to pay a fine every time they say that because it's nothing but a lie. Today, almost all black folks know better than to vote for Republicans. Caveat: I don't vote for just Republicans. I vote across lines. I vote what they call a moral agenda. So if you're moral, if you have a righteous agenda, then I will vote for you. I know some Republicans, they won't do that. They vote Republican across the board. They don't care. So, He says, today, almost all black folks know better than to vote for Republicans, which would be like chickens voting for a fox. But when Lincoln was around, the Republican Party was one of the best friends that black people had. Look at what was happening in the first half of the 1800s, the decades before the Civil War. The country didn't know what to do about slavery. The South wanted it and the North didn't, and the two sides kept coming up with agreements that didn't work out. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 made it so there couldn't be slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of a certain point. Both sides agreed. Then, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which let people living in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves what to do about the issue of slavery. Because Kansas and Nebraska were in the old Louisiana Territory, and because they were north of where the Missouri Compromise said there couldn't be slavery, passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act was about the same as ripping up the Missouri Compromise. The pro-slavery folks were happy. The anti-slavery folks were ticked off. And those ticked off folks, the ones who wanted no parts of slavery, were the ones who started the Republican Party. Yep. You think if Donald Trump had been around in 1854, he would have been unhappy with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or Paul Ryan, or Mitch McConnell? Dream on. Then came the Dred Scott decision in 1857. It was a huge case. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri. His master moved for a while to a spot in the northern part of the Louisiana Territory and took Scott with him. They later went back to Missouri. After that, Scott sued his master. He said that since he had been on soil that was supposed to be free, he was now a free man. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court pretty much told Dred Scott, screw you. Why are you wasting our time with this mess? You're a black man and a slave. You don't have any rights. They used fancier words than that, but it worked out to the same thing. This is where the Supreme Court Judge Taney, Roger Taney, and they actually just removed his statue here in Maryland a couple of weeks ago. He is the one who wrote the ruling that a black man has no rights which a white man is bound to or forced to respect. All right, so that's where that ruling came from. It seemed that the highest court in the land was on the side of slavery, and that he made the anti-slavery folks mighty depressed. All of them except Frederick Douglass. His view was pretty much, look, all this means is if we want to get rid of slavery, we can't do it with little agreements on pieces of paper. Something big has got to happen. He was right. Something big did happen. A couple of things. The first was John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, which I'll get to in a minute. Then in 1860, the new Republican Party's man, Abraham Lincoln, got elected. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in the South on paper. I know people think, oh, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. No, he freed the slaves in the South on paper with the Emancipation Proclamation. And then they got freed for real when the North kicked the South's evil, redneck, racist, slave-owning behind in the Civil War. And the South surrendered in 1865. Dick Gregory's words, not mine, okay? As bad as the Dred Scott decision was, it helped folks see what needed to happen in the future. All right, so we're going to stop there because I do not want to rush over what he says about John Brown and the outbreak of the Civil War. It is very, very, very important. So we're going to stop here for today. I hope that you have learned something new. Maybe you didn't know that it was the Republican Party that opposed slavery initially. Unfortunately, people switch sides all the time. You now have the Republicans have become the Democrats or the Dixiecrats, and the Dixiecrats or the Democrats have now become more of the Republican mindset from the beginning, okay? Which is why lots of black Republicans like myself are going to have to register as independent, because right now, all of them crazy. That's what I have to say. But I want to say thank you to those who have joined me for another Daring Dialogues. And I know that I'm probably going to get some inboxes about what I just said about the Republican Party. But you know what? I have a right to say something. I do. 20 years. I got lots to say. I've said it some days. I've said it up here in DC, and haven't really been heard. But it's okay, because it's okay when I just leave altogether because y'all not listening. Y'all not listening to the black folks in the Republican Party. You're only listening to the ones that give the talking points of the Confederacy right now. The rest of us are like, we gone. Bye. Because y'all are off message. You're off message. So I want to say thank you again for watching Daring Dialogues. Thank you for allowing me to go over. I believe I've been over about 5 minutes now. So thank you for the extra time. I hope that you have learned something today. I hope you will go back and study. I hope you will go back and research some of the things that we talked about. I definitely hope you will research Cointelpro and the goal of Cointelpro concerning the black community and the destiny of black people in the United States. All right. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light somewhere to somebody. Thank you again for your time and attention. Take care and God bless.